Welcome, I'm Kate. I have been living on a boat since 1999 and I've had a composting toilet system since 2014. And tonight I want to look at trying to separate fact from fiction because there's so many ideas and comments floating around that aren't particularly accurate. I've put three names on this. I'm Kate Saffin. John Cosham, often known as John Compost Cosham, is here. He's a master composter who lives on land in New York. And Martin Doyle, who isn't with us, but who has over 20 years experience of building separating toilets, using them. He currently works for WooWoo, who are the UK importers of Separate and Airhead. So there's very little Martin doesn't know about the inside of a separating toilet. What I want to look at is to start with the bigger picture, that dealing with our waste is a much, much bigger issue than just a couple of thousand separating toilets on the UK canals. To cover the basics of what a separating toilet is, what a composting system looks like, what we know about the numbers of separating toilet users, dealing with bacteria and pathogens, because that's a big concern for many, what we know about how users manage their systems, the Canal and River Trust's response and current position, and finally, what the future might look like. I'm not going to try and convince you should throw away your cassette, unplumb your pump out, or put a match to your incinerator toilet. If you're here because you're not really sure about the whole thing, that's not what I'm here about. I'm not here to convince anybody. What I want to do is address some of the concerns, and it will be evidence-based. The comments and quotes are all from boating Facebook groups or canal forums. Any figures or data I present come from surveys I've undertaken or CRT have undertaken. And the supporting evidence is all research sourced through literature searches. My background, although many of you will know me as a writer, as an actor, sharing stories on the canals, is that I was originally a nurse and then researcher in public health. I've done a lot of survey work, although my PhD was actually in qualitative research, but research is where I've come from. And I still use that now because most of our work as Alarum is sharing the stories of women based on accurate historical information or oral histories. So the bigger story here are a couple of comments on the subject of sewage. I rather like the tried and tested method because I think it both shows the idea that we have something reliable, but also the word tested, of course, is exactly what the system is. This is more of the real picture. But in 2021, water firms in, sorry, I need to move our pictures out of the way. Water firms in England release raw sewage into rivers and coastal waters for 2.7 million hours. Yorkshire Water discharged raw water into the waterways for more than 400,000. Thames Water for 163,000, and in total, water firms in England discharge raw sewage into rivers 372,533 times. So, yeah, we do have a very tested system, and we're all part of this whole bigger picture. Oh, went the wrong way. There are over 21,000 licensed sewer overflows, in other words, places where people are allowed to discharge into rivers. The other 11% go into the sea when there's really heavy rain. And only 14% of British rivers meet good environmental standards. And I suspect most of you have seen plenty of newspaper stories about issues in rivers. And one of the sources I will include, I'll send you some links after this, but Surfers Against Sewage have a lot to say on the subject. And I'm sure a lot of you saw David Walliams become extremely ill as he tried to swim down the Thames. And for the lady who's joined us from California, the USA has many of the same issues. I've included organic waste because another big area of another issue which comes partly into the issue about what we do with Humanure as it comes out of a separating toilet, because it's organic waste, but actually any organic waste is bad in landfill. And research by RAP, which is the waste something action project.
Resources, action. Yeah, I forgot what the AP is, but waste and resources.
It's the A is action. It's the waste and resources action project. So it talks about 19 billion worth of food, and it's something like it's over 9 million tons of actual content, and responsible for 25 million tons of greenhouse gases. And the other one, which I think puts voters into somewhere between a rock and a hard place, is that food scraps and waste disposed of in the canal or river decompose by using the available dissolved oxygen. Aquatic life depends on oxygen. And there's a lot of boaters who think that feeding the fish scraps of food, well, that scraps dumped in the water are feeding the fish. They're not. They're killing them. Numbers. The CRT 2020 boat count came up with 31,130. You see various other estimates, but they're all round about between 31 and 35,000. CRT estimate that 5% of boats, so around 1,750, have a separating toilet. What we don't have is any more detail on that as to whether what those 5% comprise in terms of boat usage. You know, are they 1,500 boats that only take the odd trip, or are they full-time liveaboards? I suspect that it veers much more towards the high use and liveaboard, because I think that's the group who most often find practical issues that they want to address, and they find changing over to separating and composting is the way to go. So in a nutshell, for anyone who's never seen one, a separating toilet contains it has two containers and a funnel, clean uncontaminated urine, a fairly dry mix of feces and carbon cover, such as sawdust, coir and small animal bedding. It's about 50-50 probably. And poo is about 75 to 80% water. So the actual amount of organic material is quite small, probably about 1,500 mils in a 10-litre container. And if I've calculated that wrong, somebody will tell me. And each is diverted to the right place by a separator. And the decomposition is by aerobic bacteria in the presence of oxygen. That's the big difference to a flushing system, a sewage system. A water-based toilet contains sewage, which is a mix of urine and feces, the water used to flush, and any additives to assist breakdown. And the decomposition is by anaerobic bacteria, and a byproduct of that is methane. And that process actually produces a gas, which is the smell we associate with toilets. Here are some examples. You can have anything. When you have a separating toilet, you have a vast choice of what it can look like. Over here, we have the separate and the airhead, the Scandinavian commercial ones, very much built for off-grid housing. Then there's the artisan build ones like Compost and Simplu. You can have beautiful, pretty ones with a glittery separator from Strumpet and Trollope. This is the type that Martin used to build, and you can buy the components and you can make your own. So one of the reasons people like it is because it provides some flexibility in terms of fitting into perhaps an awkward space. What happens to the contents? Here we have a couple of urine containers. This is the common sizes, around 4 litres and 10, which is emptied into an Elson or diluted and used to water a tree. And then carbon cover, and these basically is a series of 3 pictures of a process. So this is at the very beginning with some slightly dampened woodcat litter, fluffed up, which provides a basic carbon mix. And here it's been in use for a little while. This is my own loo. It gets mixed every time I use it. So there's no obvious, particularly no obvious fecal matter. It's all dug in. And then as it gets fuller, it starts to resemble soil, even though it's not fully composted at that stage. And if this works, this shows you the kind of consistency and the mixing. But it can't play the media. I don't know why. And this is one which is completely composted. It looks as if it shrunk down to almost nothing, but that's a slightly distorted view. In fact, it's a 25-litre bucket. It's probably gone down to about 18, about the size of a bag of B&Q compost that you might buy for the garden. And that stage, I take it off and donate it to a friend's garden. because it saves him buying a bag of compost from P&Q. Now, coming on to some of the comments, toilets and our excreta is a really very, very sensitive subject. It's very emotive, and people can get really quite upset around it, but especially on boats. I mean, it's always said that it's the most popular topic to talk about on boats. One thing about compost is it's added an extra in. We used to just argue about cassette versus pump out. Now we can argue about compost, cassette and pump out, and even incinerating. Lots more choice. So here are some examples that I chose because of the kind of thing they illustrate. Poop in a box, worst Victorian child's toy ever. Now, I'm pretty certain that the person who made this comment, based on other things, has a cassette or a porta potty. Now, I might be stretching a point, but it seems to me that pretty much resembles a box. And in fact, when you look at boat toilets, whether it's a small tank on a porta potty or a bigger tank on a pump out, they are all what the World Health Organization calls container-based systems. So if you're on a boat, you're pooping in a box. We all are. It's just a different sort of box, and some boxes are more sophisticated than others, but that's the gist of it. This is quite a common type of comment that somebody is just, their gut reaction is to go, oh, no, it's just awful. And I think it illustrates how we get comfortable with certain things and we stop worrying about them. Because you could actually switch. I'm going to pause briefly and say, John, could you check everybody is muted because there's some rustling?
Well, I know that Claire Healy, could you switch your microphone?
On or off?
Off.
On. Off.
Off, please.
Yeah, you can do it.
Mute.
That's it. You've done it. Fantastic. That'll make it a lot easier for everybody else. Thank you.
This one, composting toilets, disgusting. I feel ill just reading this. I think that shows how much of a gut reaction we have to something that feels unfamiliar. I mean, I remember my first experience of emptying a porta potty and I thought, this is revolting. By about the third time, I'd sort of got used to it. And by the fifth or sixth, it was becoming habit. And after that, it just became something I did twice a week. And I think you could actually replace that word composting with just about anything. I think somebody with a pump out might find a cassette disgusting because you have to carry it out of the boat and stand over it while you empty it. Somebody with a cassette might think a pump out is disgusting because they don't like the idea of having a great big tank of sewage on the boat, particularly if it's under their bed. So this is very much about what we're comfortable and familiar with. I included this one. I'm not entirely sure what a virtue signalling idiocy is, but it's partly included because actually the Canelo River Trust, I'm not sure exactly what the writer's referring to in terms of closing, but you will see later when I come to their to CRT's position, they are not against separating toilets and compost systems. They're actually being very supportive. They, like everywhere, has a lot of issues in dealing with issues around sanitary stations and sewage points and problems. And this is just for fun, really. I just, I like the idea. We can all be hippies, even over our toilets. We can be hippies.
Nothing wrong with hippies. Now, this is another comment. Composting toilet is a totally incorrect term. It's simply a term used by the deluded to convince themselves they are green. It is a misleading term. I would say the deluded are probably the only people who don't use the term composting toilet because we are composting and know it's a system and it's not just a toilet. But, oh, I've done it again, press the wrong button. Unfortunately, it has become shorthand for waterless toilets, whether it's the all-in-one system or separating, in exactly the same way, when I thought about it, that pump out, cassette, macerator are actually shorthand for big tank, small tank, and liquidizer systems. The toilet itself is a funnel. Whether it's a single funnel into a sewage system or a separating one into a composting system, it's a funnel.
But it is unfortunate, and it isn't helped by the fact the Environment Agency and DEFRA use it. In fact, I think from the information that Martin sent me about planning today, I think actually even planning legislation talks about composting, although they might be compost. Toilet manufacturers often use it because they find it's what potential customers search for. So they say that they wouldn't get found. So there we have a situation where the internet is kind of, the algorithms it uses actually generate this unfortunate misleading term. And there are a number of video loggers and other YouTube video makers who use the term as well. So, and people often start by researching on YouTube. So again, they're picking it up from there. But I have managed to wean the compost group and CRT off it. Another comment, my own impression is that novices are inclined to believe the vernacular description of composting toilet literally. And I have to say, that's probably a fair comment, because based on the responses to the joining question for the composting group, that does seem to be the starting point for many. Lots of the requests, I want to know more about composting toilets. What's the best brand of composting toilet? So to counter that, we have frequent reminders that it's a system, not a magic toilet. We've got an extensive collection of files and research. There's support from experienced composters, both on boats and on land. It's a space to ask difficult and sensitive questions without fear of judgment. And if somebody is a judge, we jump on them because that is unnecessary and it doesn't really help. One of my particular things about some of the very critical stuff that is said about composting is that if you really feel that a separation toilet and a composting system is the worst thing that could ever happen and they're absolutely terrible, if you want to change somebody's behavior, tell them they're stupid. Because I don't know about you, but if you start telling me I'm wrong, that's not going to help me change my behavior. If we want people to do this thing properly, we need to support them. We have regular online workshops and teaching sessions. I do some in person, but quite a lot online. There's a smaller subgroup specifically for new composters on boats, started after the CRT edict of last February, and they said that binning, which they had recommended, was now no longer acceptable. And I and the manufacturers and several other significant players, people who are involved in some way in research or in providing services, have fairly regular meetings with CRT to try and help move things forward. And on to the next one. Oh, foolish people, you fell for another boat or gimmick thinking you were being green. And there's kind of something in that, because some do start from environmental concern. I think perhaps particularly people who are starting with a new boat are thinking that way. But for many, it's about dealing with a current practical problem. And here are some examples. We're tired of lugging heavy, often leaky cassettes to the nearest smelly Elson only to find it blocked or broken. A toilet that smells. Hated my cassette toilet. Nasty stained scratch white plastic. Heavy cassettes. When we got our current narrow boat, the smell from the holding tank was awful. So you take on a boat that's with an older system. The new, if you've got a nice new macerator system, I'm sure it doesn't smell, but the older ones might do. The next one was actually me leaving a temporary mooring in London with a porta potty. You can't get spare tanks, and Elsons are few and far between. And I found of all the things I could be worried about boating around London, finding a mooring, having my bike stolen, having a break-in, actually it was how I was going to empty the loo. And that's what started me looking at composting. And for somebody else, originally the cost. I don't know whether that £5 a week, whether that's cumulative towards pump out or whether they had to pay to empty a cassette, but for them there was a cost. But then as people get into the system, they tend to find all sorts of other advantages. So here we have somebody who's growing strawberries, runner beans, rhubarb and chard. Quite a lot of people use the compost for plants on the roof. They often find they're growing stray tomato plants as well. Control, freedom, cheap, no planned routes around marinas, and more storage space under the bed. Valuing the fact that composting uses no water, no chemicals. squaring the circle, journey to zero waste, really starting to think about what their waste means. It's my waste, so I should have to deal with it. Personally, I got increasingly uncomfortable with the word waste. It's only waste if we waste it. So in a nutshell, quite a lot of us do gradually become fucking composting toilet hippies. Going on to the issue of bacteria and pathogens, because this is a very important one. And the comment I've pulled up there is that poo can be full of nasties, and it can. But it's important to put it into a degree of, essentially, not all nasties are created equal. So there's two broad groups. There's the built-in ones, the ones we've all got. Trillions of fecal coliforms, and they are essential for a healthy gut and digestion. If we didn't have them, we'd be in trouble, but we really don't need to eat them again. However, they do love our guts. That's why they live there. They like a temperature, nice, warm, moist gut, 37.5-ish degrees centigrade. And as soon as they leave it, things start to get more hostile and they will start to die off. If you can compost, if you can hot compost, then they'll be dead within an hour, a few hours. But even in cold composting, the longest they last is about 3 months. E. coli is the one that's used as a marker because that's the one that can last longest. So if you can, I haven't yet found a way we can test compost. I would like to. There are tests for fecal contamination in water, but how you would apply that to compost, I don't know. You'd have to create a solution and then test it. And I need a biochemist to work out what the proportions of that should be. The other group is the acquired. And quite simply, this includes quite a lot of very serious things, but quite simply, if you haven't caught whatever it is, it won't be in your poo. Worms are common in many parts of the country. They're not, or fairly common in the UK, but most others are pretty rare. If you've got worms or protozoa or any of those serious ones, you'll probably have symptoms and you will be needing treatment. Some can survive for a year or more. Composting does seem to be quite a good way to deal with them, but needs longer. We need to be certain they're absolutely dead. Viruses are the most tricky, I think, because there seems to be a lot of variation in how long they will survive. And it seems that some will survive in soil for a year or more. That what we don't know really is the extent to which that means they are still viable and what you would need to do to actually catch something from them. So, you'd have to have quite extensive contact, I think. But so those are the ones to be concerned about. But if you haven't caught them, they're not going to be in your poo. It's only going to be the fecal coliforms. Now, this is a big one. Is it true that no one composts? If social media is to be believed, it's not really a composting toilet as you never let the stuff compost. I wager less than 1% of composters actually compost. It's simply the convenience of chucking it in a waste bin and forgetting about it. This is another interesting parallel with current sewage systems, because I will put my hand up and I will say, perfectly honest, when I had a porta potty, which I did for 13 years, I never, ever, not once, did I ever stand over the Elson emptying it and then walk away thinking about it. I'd emptied it, I rinsed it out, it was gone. So I think we all empty our toilets and forget about it. This is a fairly typical example of a comment from somebody who hasn't seen a system on a boat. It's a perfectly valid point of view from somebody who thinks that there wouldn't be space. What I find a little difficult about it is that it's presented as a statement, as a fact, as though it's true. And actually, we'll see there are quite a lot of people composting on boats. So it isn't a no-go. We find the space, we've made it work. Again, another judgmental one. You can't compost, you just pretend, then you chuck it away for other people to deal with. Well, we come back to our sewage, don't we? Pour that down the Elson, pump it out for somebody else to deal with. It's no different.
And finally, waterless toilets are just posh buckets and chuckets. Water toilets are just posh buckets and chuckets too. We all have, on a boat, it's all container-based systems. When we start looking at the questions, we can talk a little bit about how that might be different if you're setting up a system on land. But on a boat, even if it's got a nice porcelain loo funnel and a macerator and a lovely big tank, it's still a posh bucket and you chuck it. Now, this is relating to, I'm not sure I made this quite clear, and does it, this binning it, does it matter? And here, this is coming from the other side. This is a couple of misunderstandings from the separator user side. Fundamentally, poop is just soil, whether it's soil in the landfill or the septic leaching field, and it will break down and compost in landfill, won't it? No, it isn't, and it won't. It's organic waste. Just like that food waste, it will decompose anaerobically, create methane and contribute to greenhouse gases. Now, admittedly, it is a very small contribution, given that it's joining 3 billion nappies and 3.8 million tonnes of food waste every year. So I did a little bit of modelling. It's about 35,000 boats on CRT managed canals. They estimate 5% have a separating toilet, 1750. So let's assume that there are 2 people living full-time on each of those 1750 boats. They fill a 23-litre container each month. That creates 484 tonnes of content a year. That's 484,000 kilos. 35% are binning full-time and 20% are binning some of the time. Let's assume half the time, just for the sake of calculations. So working all that out in a nice spreadsheet, I came up with that means that 267 tonnes of material is going to landfill each year. Now, 267 tonnes is about the size of a peanut in relation to 3.8 million tonnes. So even if every single boater started using it, our issue with organic waste in landfill is far, far bigger than anything anybody's going to be doing with a separating toilet. And because the poo is 75% to 80% water, about 70 tonnes of that is organic material. Now, what we know about what people are doing with the toilet contents, this is going to work across 3 different surveys. So I don't want to get bogged down in too much detail. I'm going to concentrate a little bit on how many people are binning, because that is the thing that people are concerned about. If they're composting, then we're not. That's good, because it's going to be returned to the soil. So in February 2019, I did the Great Big Boating Bog survey, which asked questions of all users, not just compost or separating toilets. And there, it was about a third each way. 30% always composted, 43% always bagged and binned, 27% used both at different times. So bit of a leaning towards the bagging and binning, but quite a bit of composting too. Then in 2021, after the CRT announcement, I did a survey and 324 voters responded. These surveys are all online and self-selected, so we can't extrapolate too much from them. At that point, nearly half, over here, 46.4%, had been binning before the CRT announcement. This was because back in 2017, they had actually put the guidance onto the website to recommend binning. And that caused a huge surge in the purchase of separating toilets and binning. And it didn't matter how much in the compost group I said, it's not really a very good thing to do. It was there on the website as a recommendation. So it was very hard to argue with. So at that point, we had quite a lot of people. So we've got 28% who are going to carry on composting, quite a chunk who are going to start composting either because they meant to or because they kind of felt they should. Quite a bit of going to do some binning, but we'll have a go at composting. And 14% who said, I'm just going to carry on binning it.
On to a year later, much smaller sample, only 182 people replied. Now, fully composting, we seem to be up at the over 40% with around 35% binning. To be honest, I think it's probably broadly similar across the whole period, actually, because I suspect that those composting were perhaps a little quicker, well, happier to respond to a survey. I suspect because of all the discussion and on occasions, frankly, vitriolic attacks for being such bad people, that those who were binning just quietly didn't want to talk to anybody about it. And that's a shame, because if they did, we could perhaps help them move to something that would work better. Finally, I've got a couple of charts on those who are planning to change to a separating toilet. And I'm afraid the colours aren't consistent. So on this occasion, this 41%, they basically don't know. They haven't decided. So it's possibly a new boat. Oh no, sorry, that was in 2021. Now, and at that point, yes, about 20% were planning to bin. And when we got to 2022, we're here at 17, basically 18%, pretty much the same, are planning to bin. That I find a little sad and a little discouraging. I have great sympathy for those who were binning before and found the goalposts move, but I really hope that we've been trying to persuade people not to take on a separating toilet unless they can get on with the composting. But at least it's probably reducing the amount that's being binned. So in summary, fully composting does seem to have grown from 30% to about 41%. A further 20% doing at least some composting, 35% intend to carry on bagging and binning, a handful are drying and burning their content. So people are experimenting with some different ways. And also those planning to change, 1 in 5 is planning to bin, which, as I say, is a little disappointing. Oh, we seem to have repeated a slide there. Now we move on to dealing with it. Now this is the bit that Martin has provided for me. Getting rid of the compost is very difficult if you abide by all the recommendations and regulations. I think one of the things that people who haven't any experience of composting loos or composting systems is an image that somehow there's a huge amount of it. It's not unusual to see a comment like, well, you know, I'm not going to carry buckets of shite around on my roof. Well, you've seen a picture of what it looks like earlier. There's not that much. And it isn't, you know, you're not sitting, you haven't got an open bucket like a cassette of sewage. You've got something that's really quite dry because of all the carbon cover that's mixed into it. So this is what Martin said, is that his understanding for domestic users comes down to building regulations. For legality, then Environment Agency, and Health and Safety, which is local authority, composting, and possibly the Environment Agency for liquid disposal. In 2010, the new Part G of the building regulations mentions compost toilets for the first time, part of a drive to reduce domestic water consumption by 18%. And the next one is interesting in terms of boating. In a house, you can use a chemical or compost toilet if you have a route to remove the waste without going through any living space or food preparation area. Now, if you applied that strictly to boats, only people with pump out. Everybody would have to have a pump out, because in reality, if you've got a cassette or a porta potty, you almost certainly have to carry it through some bit of your living space. In which case, I would argue, although I'm not trying to sell anybody separating toilets, actually having the urine and feces separate actually is much less of an issue in any spills. One of the things I found in the 2019 survey was I think over half of people with a cassette had been splashed quite a few times in the last few months as they emptied it. It never gets splashed by a dry toilet. Solids composting can generally be done on a small scale, providing it's done in a manner that doesn't pose any danger to people in the environment. So the scale we're working at, small scale domestic, is well under any requirement for any kind of waste management permit. Liquid, you can dispose of up to 10 litres a day into the ground. So in a house or forest school or something like that, that would be via a soak away. If you're boating, then obviously you're probably going to take it to a different place each day, so that spreads it out. It should be 10 metres away from a watercourse and 50 metres from a well or source of potable water. And he finishes by saying all of this is subject to local interpretation. And there are differences between Scotland, England and Wales. So particularly if you're in a land-based situation, then it's something you need to explore with the local authority to try and suss out what the rules are. But it can be tricky, because we found from discussions in the group that very often there isn't anybody in the local authority with experience that can really help. So we're nearly there. Canelo River Trust position. They are supportive and they are open to alternative approaches for a number of reasons. One is that as boating increases, installing new facilities, which people are often asking for, needs not just money and somewhere to put it, but the existing infrastructure to connect it to. And I talked to somebody who works for the trust, who is a boater in London, doesn't work in anything to do with toilets, but he said the problem is that London's sewage infrastructure is creaking already. Permission to add yet another input to it would be very difficult to get. I've put I put XX for the cost of unblocking Elsons. I have an idea, it's in the region of 30,000. I have asked, and it seems that it is not a figure that can be plucked off a shelf, because actually several different departments are involved in the costs of things like unblocking Elsons. And it's quite often a criticism that it's people with separating toilets who block Elsons, but they don't monitor the problem. But the general opinion, the general view from those who do it, is that wet wipes are the biggest offender. And interestingly, shoes, apparently, shoes turn up quite a lot. Also, conserving water is central to their operation. So supporting anything that uses less of it, when we look back at that planning thing about reducing domestic water use, fits the overall ethos. They are willing to give permission for composting on offside moorings and leased land, but not towpath. But that's because not because it's compost, it's because you're not supposed to have anything on a towpath mooring. But it does need some work on process. We have got as far as the risk assessment, but we need to write a bit more about policy and process, and so that they don't, the key point is that nothing is left if the moorers move on. And then coming back to this one, they won't provide composting facilities. Now, personally, I think that's quite a good thing, because they struggle enough with the bins they've got. And if they did, they would be sited at sanitary stations. And, you know, when you look at what happens to recycling bins on the waterways, because people are travelling through, there isn't anything like that same sense of ownership or respect that people have for a bin in their front garden. And they would end up contaminated. We'd end up with composting recycling and recycling in landfill and landfill in the compost. I mean, it would just be, you know, it would be all over the place. So my final thing is to say that whatever we do with our waste has an environmental impact and involves compromises. Separating toilets aren't going to go away. So the important thing is education, support, advice, new infrastructure, not condemnation and judgment. We do need to build an infrastructure that achieves hot composting, so it's safe, because I cold compost, but that's only my own material. I know exactly what's in it. If I were running a scheme for, say, a whole boat club or a marina or a village, I would make sure that was set up so that it did achieve hot composting, but it did have probably at least a year, probably 2 before it was used, because I don't know what's coming into it. And as I said already, sited away from sanitary or sewage facilities to avoid cross-contamination. There are some current initiatives. 2 of them are case studies on the CRT website on the page. One is Circular Revolution, which is a collection scheme in London. The other is Urban Moorings in Wolverhampton that boaters may visit and deposit their bucket of Humanure.
You may not arrive by car, because if they allowed that, they'd drown. And finally, a land project called Movement in Motion in West Ilsley, where you can drive and take material. And the aim, Marnie, who's running that, is also reaching out to camper vans and other kinds of travellers. So it isn't particularly focused on the waterways. So that covers it. I will now stop our recording and we'll have some questions.